A mask cracked in silence, but hiding deadly truths. Welcome to Eco Mysteriosa. I am your host, Ravela. Tell me in the comments, where are you listening from today? Your words make these mysteries unforgettable. Now let's begin. It was upon a grey and blustery morning in late October of 1894 that I found myself once more in the sitting room of 221B Baker Street, warmed not so much by the fire crackling in the grate as by the company of my singular friend, Mr. Sherlock Holmes. The weather outside clung to the windows like damp gauze, smearing London's outlines into ghostly silhouettes. Holmes sat cross-legged in the armchair opposite mine, the fingertips of both hands pressed together in that characteristic steeple which always signaled deep thought. A thick monograph on Renaissance forgery lay neglected upon the table. "You've abandoned Paolo Uccello mid-dissection," I remarked, nodding toward the book. "My dear Watson," Holmes said without glancing up, "the man was a genius in perspective, but a fraud when it came to authenticity. I have tired of his illusions." Before I could respond, there came a rapid succession of footsteps upon the stair, followed by a knock, a single, firm rap. Mrs. Hudson opened the door a moment later, ushering in a man whose appearance was calculated to stir curiosity in even the most indifferent observer. He was of middle height and dressed in the severe style of a clergyman, though a heavy scarf and gloves suggested some reluctance to embrace the chill. His eyes, keen and green-grey, darted around the room before settling upon Holmes. In his left hand, he clutched a velvet-lined wooden box, small, square, and clasped shut with brass hinges. "Mr. Holmes," he said, "I am the Reverend Josiah Marrow. I fear I bring with me a matter both grotesque and urgent." Holmes inclined his head with polite interest. "Pray, sit, Reverend Marrow. You have chosen your words well. Grotesque and urgent, two qualities that often prove fertile ground for inquiry. May I offer you brandy or tea?" "Tea, if it's no trouble," Marrow replied, lowering himself to the edge of the chair as though loath to burden its upholstery. His gloved fingers tightened around the box. As I poured the tea, Holmes observed, "You carry that object as one might cradle a relic or a threat. You have not parted with it since entering. Shall we begin there?" The Reverend gave a short nod and placed the box upon the table. "I have brought it to you because I do not know what else to do. It arrived at my residence 3 nights ago. No message, no messenger. Simply this thing." He opened the box with slow deliberation. Inside, nestled on black velvet, lay a white theatrical mask, the kind worn in Venetian pantomimes. It was cracked, no, split, from the crown down through the left cheek. But the fracture was clean, as if done by deliberate force, not time or wear. A single drop of what appeared to be dried blood clung to the edge of the break. Watson leaned in. "A curious item. You say it was delivered without a word. No card, no note. I found it left on my doorstep in a brown parcel, wrapped in string. No one saw who placed it there. I've asked around, but—" He paused, his lips compressing into a thin line. "There is more. The night it arrived, I heard music in the vicarage garden. Not loud. A waltz, played softly and slightly off-key. When I stepped outside, there was nothing but mist." Holmes reached for the mask and held it delicately in the candlelight. He examined the crack, then sniffed the edge of the blood stain. "Interesting," he murmured. "The blood is human, not more than a few days old. Male, I should think. Possibly of Mediterranean descent." "Good heavens, Holmes," I exclaimed. "From a mere smear." "Observation, Watson, not guesswork. The size of the droplet, its coagulation, the faint iron scent. It is sufficient." Reverend Marrow leaned forward. "You see, Mr. Holmes, I have reason to fear this is not a mere prank. My younger brother, Gideon, vanished 4 years ago in Naples. He was an actor. This mask, though cracked, is from a set he once used in a production of Il Matto Nero, The Black Fool. He had it commissioned personally. There were only 3 ever made. Holmes' eyes gleamed. And yet this one returns, damaged and bloodied, with no explanation. Was your brother ever found? Number. He left no trace. Until now, perhaps. Holmes stood and paced, hands behind his back. Very well, Reverend. I accept your case. The mask speaks. The music whispers. And somewhere between the crack and the silence lies your answer. He turned abruptly toward me. Watson, I believe we must pay a visit to the vicarage at St. Jude's in Hampstead. I fancy the garden might still be echoing with its secret tune. Reverend Merrow closed the box gently. You will come today? Within the hour, Holmes said. But first, Watson, fetch the Bradshaw. We must determine which train passes closest to Naples at the time of your brother's disappearance. Some ghosts do not rise without timetables. And so began a case unlike any I'd encountered, one in which music, theatre, and death intertwined beneath the cracked smile of a harlequin mask. The journey to Hampstead was a short one, though the autumnal chills seemed determined to make every step from the station to the vicarage a test of endurance. Holmes strode ahead, the collar of his overcoat turned up against the wind, his eyes scanning not merely the path, but the surrounding hedgerows, rooftops, and chimney-pots, as if expecting them to offer commentary on the mystery that had begun with the cracked mask. Reverend Merrow met us at the vicarage gates. It's just as I left it, he said, ushering us through the iron gate and across the gravel path that wound around the modest but handsome stone building. The garden behind the vicarage was enclosed by a low wall of aged brick, draped here and there in ivy that trembled in the breeze. There was no sign of any disturbance, at least to my eye. I've kept it locked since the mask arrived, Merrow explained as he led us through the back door into the narrow garden. I've not stepped foot here since. Holmes halted at the threshold and remained still for a moment, as though the very air of the place required analysis before proceeding further. Then, without a word, he stepped forward and began a slow, methodical circuit of the garden's edge, his gaze low and movements deliberate. I stood beside the Reverend, my notebook in hand, watching as Holmes bent to inspect a patch of moss near a stone bench, then flicked away a dead leaf that had settled atop a paving stone. Curious, he murmured, tapping the stone with his cane. Reverend, do you often have visitors to this part of the garden? Hardly ever, Merrow replied. It's usually just myself, and even then, not often. I prefer the front walk. Then it's most curious indeed that someone recently moved this bench. He tapped the leg with the tip of his cane. The moss beneath it has been crushed in a pattern consistent with recent repositioning, and see here. He crouched to indicate the brick beneath the bench. A faint impression, almost a smudge, marred the otherwise pristine moss. An irregular curve with a narrow slot. It resembles the heel of a boot, possibly foreign make. No other impressions nearby, which means the intruder stood here quite still for some time. Waiting, perhaps, or listening. I stepped closer, but there's only the one mark. No trail leading to it or away from it. Exactly, Watson. Which tells us either the intruder was remarkably light-footed, which is unlikely given the depth of this impression, or they entered from above. Above, I repeated, incredulous. Do you mean to say— I mean to say, Holmes interrupted, his eyes fixed on the ivy-covered wall, that we are not looking for someone who walked in through the gate. We are looking for someone who climbed down. He pointed to a segment of wall where the ivy had been disturbed, the leaves broken in a descending zigzag. There is a flat roof just beyond this wall. I should like to inspect it. Merrow looked genuinely startled. That leads to the bell tower of the chapel. There's a maintenance ladder behind it, but it hasn't been used in years. Then it would have offered the perfect means for a careful intruder to gain access without detection. Within minutes, Holmes had scaled the ladder and was examining the rooftop while I remained below with Merrow. Holmes' voice echoed faintly from above. 2 scuff marks on the coping, a piece of torn cloth, dark velvet, I believe, caught on the weathered edge of the stone, Our intruder came this way, possibly more than once. By the time Holmes descended, his face bore that taut look I'd come to recognize. Anticipation carefully reined in by calculation. "I would like to see your brother's belongings, Reverend," he said without preamble. "Everything you still have from his time here in England, letters, costumes, journals, anything that might have significance." "I kept a trunk in the attic," Merrow replied. "Come, I'll show you." Inside the vicarage, the Reverend led us up a narrow staircase to the dusty attic. A single trunk marked Ja-M sat beneath the slanted roof. The Reverend opened it slowly, revealing a carefully folded collection of theatrical costumes, 2 small notebooks, and several letters bound in twine. Holmes went through them with meticulous precision. "Here," he said, lifting one of the notebooks. "Gideon's rehearsal diary. Let's see. October 1st, 1890. Bruno forgets his cue again. Tonight's performance of Il Matto Nero was dreadful. Giovanni says the mask feels wrong. He claims it's cursed." Holmes' brow furrowed as he flipped ahead. October 14th. Received the new mask. The crack along the cheek is deliberate, the artist says. Meant to reflect the dual nature of the fool. I don't care for it. There's something in the eyes. I feel watched even when I wear it. He closed the notebook with a snap. "There were 3 masks, you said?" "Yes," Merrow confirmed. "Gideon kept the first one. The second was sent to the production in Naples. And the third, he said it had been damaged and left with the artist. I would like a name for that artist." "I don't know it," Merrow admitted. "Gideon mentioned a man named Rizzo, I believe. Or Rico, something like that." "Then we shall consult our friends in Naples," Holmes said. "But in the meantime, this delivery of the mask to you, paired with the garden visit and the music, these were not random events. They were acts of theatrical design. Someone wanted your attention, perhaps someone who knows Gideon's final days better than we do." As we descended, Holmes turned to me. "Watson, do you remember the baritone line from Il Matto Nero? The fool plays the tune of mourning backwards to summon truth from shadows." "I do," I said, recalling the line from a dusty program Holmes once made me read. "What of it?" "Because the waltz Reverend Merrow heard, if it was that tune, played in reverse, wouldn't just be an eerie trick. It would be a message." He stopped by the drawing-room mantelpiece and stared into the small mirror that hung above it. "This case is not merely about a disappearance. It is about a performance. Someone is staging scenes for us, Watson, and if we wish to reach the final act, we must learn the script before they turn the lights out." And with that, he tapped the cracked mask with one finger, gently, as though not to disturb the spirit behind it. Then he turned toward the fire, his eyes lost in flame. The journey back to Baker Street was undertaken in near silence. Holmes sat with his chin tucked into his chest, his eyes half-lidded in a state that to the casual observer might suggest slumber, but which I knew to be the intense internal activity of his remarkable mind. I refrained from interrupting him. Over the years, I'd learned to recognize when he was assembling fragments into patterns, sifting the noise from the essential melody, the cracked mask, the reversed waltz, the vanished actor brother, the solitary footprint by the garden bench. It was a curious overture, and Holmes was reading the score. By the time we arrived, the lamplighters were just beginning their work, and the fog that had lifted slightly in the afternoon was once more sliding down from the rooftops like a reluctant curtain at the end of a play. Holmes said nothing until we reached the door to 221B. There, with his key halfway in the lock, he turned sharply to me. "Watson, you must write a telegram. 2, in fact. 1 to the Neapolitan police. Request any record of a Gideon Merrow, English actor, last seen in 1890. Ask about any performances of Il Matto Nero, especially ones that ended abruptly. The other, send to Mycroft. Have him trace the name Rizzo or Rico, possibly an artisan or mask maker with connections to England and Italy during that period. I nodded. And the reversed waltz? I believe it to be an intentional signature. Theatrical, yes, but personal too. Someone is trying to tell us that what vanished in Naples has returned in London, but not whole. Like the mask, it's fractured. Once inside, Holmes made straight for his files, flinging open drawer after drawer in search of something. After several minutes, he emerged with a yellowing clipping and held it out to me. "The Neapolitan incident," I read aloud, noting the dateline of October 1890. 3 actors found dead in their dressing room following a performance at Teatro di Sant'Angelo. The production, Il Matto Nero, closed indefinitely. The surviving cast member, Gideon Moreau, reportedly disappeared the same night. I looked up. This was never reported in the English press. "Of course not," Holmes replied. "The Italian authorities likely considered it an internal scandal. An English actor fleeing the scene of a triple death, not something one publicizes to avoid diplomatic discomfort. But now, 4 years later, someone sends his mask to his brother, plays the waltz in his garden, and leaves no footprints. You believe Gideon is alive?" "I believe," Holmes said, lighting his pipe with a long spill, "that someone wants us to ask that question." We did not have to wait long for a reply from Mycroft. The next morning, a messenger delivered a folded note bearing his unmistakably spidery hand. "Rico Bellanti, mask artisan, Neapolitan origin, emigrated to London in 1891. Last known address, 14 Dovecote Lane, Lambeth. Suspected of minor involvement in theatrical fraud. Disappeared 1892. "Convenient," I murmured. "Or strategic," Holmes replied, already donning his coat. "If Bellanti is missing, we must see what remains of him." Lambeth in the morning mist was a far cry from Hampstead's orderly calm. The streets were narrow, damp, and lined with buildings whose windows seemed to observe us with the indifference of the weary poor. Number 14. Dovecote Lane was a narrow red brick house with boarded windows and a rusting bell. Holmes ignored the door and rapped smartly on the side window with his cane. We were met, after a time, by a young boy with tousled hair and an air of vague suspicion. "He ain't here," he said flatly. "We're not looking for him," Holmes replied. "We're looking for what he left behind." The boy looked dubious, but Holmes slipped a coin into his hand with such casual elegance that I scarcely saw the motion. "You can watch us, if you like. We shan't break anything." With that, the boy stood aside and let us in. The interior was musty, choked with dust and cobwebs. Holmes moved through it like a ghost, trailing his fingers across the surface of an old work table stained with pigment and wax. The air smelled faintly of glue, or clay, and age. In the far corner was a cabinet with warped wooden drawers. Holmes opened them one by one. Most were empty, but in the lowest, wrapped in a swatch of cloth, was another mask. It was unfinished, no paint, no straps, just the crude base of a theatrical face. Yet there was something familiar in the contours, the same ridged cheek, the suggestion of a sneer frozen in porcelain. This, Holmes said, was to be the 4th mask. He turned it over and held it to the light. A faint mark had been scratched into the interior, a symbol that resembled a stylized eye, set inside a triangle. "Have you seen that before?" I asked. "Not in person," Holmes murmured, "but in research. It is the emblem of a defunct theatrical society, La Fratellanza di Verité, the Brotherhood of Truth, founded in Florence in the mid-18th century. They believed the theater was not mere entertainment, but revelation, that through performance one could tear aside the veil of human illusion. I blinked. "You think they were involved in Gideon's disappearance?" "I think we are no longer dealing with a simple case of a vanished actor," Holmes said. "We are dealing with a performance that did not end when the curtain fell, a performance that someone is trying to resume. Suddenly, Holmes stiffened. He leaned forward and lifted something from the edge of the drawer, a single dark hair, coarse and straight, not of human texture. "Horsehair," he said softly. "Used in the lining of certain costume wigs. Fresh. Someone has been here recently. Within the last 2 days, I'd wager." He straightened, his face set. "This house is being watched or used. I must follow this trail. Watson, return to Baker Street and prepare to transcribe a letter to Inspector Lestrade. I will require him later. For now, I shall pursue a shadow that wishes to be seen only in profile." "But where are you going?" I asked. Holmes reached into the drawer once more and withdrew a small leather tag, stained and brittle with age. On it was printed, "Traviata Costume Hire, Berwick Street." "To the costumers," he said, smiling grimly. "It's time we learned who is supplying masks to ghosts." With that, he vanished into the fog, leaving me staring at the cracked face of the unfinished mask, its features frozen in that eerie suggestion of mirth, as though amused by the game it had set in motion. Holmes did not return until well past twilight, his silhouette finally reappearing through the fog beyond Baker Street, like some spectre drawn homeward by unfinished business. I'd written the letter to Lestrade as instructed, and paced the sitting-room floor more than once in my concern. When at last the familiar sound of Holmes's key turned in the lock, I rose immediately. "You've been gone hours," I said. "Traviata Costume Hire. Did it yield anything?" Holmes removed his coat with deliberate slowness, then walked to the fire, his face pale but his eyes lit with the gleam of progress. "It did more than yield, Watson. It positively performed. I found myself in the presence of one Miss Katriona Belgrave, an assistant seamstress of no small sharpness. She has an unfortunate fondness for absinthe and a theatrical streak that would rival Sarah Bernhardt. But she possesses a memory most precise. She not only recognized the leather tag as one of theirs, but she recalled precisely to whom it had been issued." "To whom?" "A Mr. Gianni Dorsey, Italian accent, dark coat, gloves even in July. Described by Miss Belgrave as a man who looked like he was always listening for his own name being whispered from across the street. Not a name I've heard." "Nor I," Holmes said. "But here's the rub. This Dorsey rented 3 costumes over the past 6 months, all for different occasions. One of them was returned with a velvet mask enclosed in the inner pocket. Another was never returned at all. When Miss Belgrave attempted to contact the address he'd provided, Mecklenburgh Square, it turned out to be a boarding house which had burned down in February." "Suggesting a false identity." "Or a deliberately shed skin. Our man, I believe, is hiding in plain sight, using the theater world as his cloak. And now he's reached out to us, through the mask, through the music, because he wants the game to resume. The question remains, why now?" As if in reply to Holmes's question, there came the sharp rap of knuckles at our door. Mrs. Hudson, ever light, of foot when startled, answered it. A moment later, she entered the sitting room, eyes wide. "Begging your pardon, gentlemen, but there's a lady, most distressed, says she must speak with Mr. Holmes immediately. I've brought her up." The woman who entered behind her was tall, veiled, and unmistakably elegant. Her gloved hands clutched a parcel of some kind, wrapped in linen and bound with twine. She remained standing as if afraid to sit, her body taut with anxiety. "Mr. Holmes," she said quickly, "my name is Anna Hirschfeld. I've come because I believe I'm being followed, and I fear it has something to do with the death of my fiancé. He was an actor. You may have heard of him. Lionel Bragg." Holmes, whose manner had grown instantly alert, inclined his head. "Indeed, I recall the name. His death was reported as a drowning, was it not? Fell into the Thames while intoxicated. An unfortunate accident." "An accident," she repeated bitterly. Yes, that was the official explanation, but Lionel had not touched drink in over a year, and I know for a fact he was terrified of water. He couldn't swim, not even in a bath without panicking. He drowned near Southwark Bridge. but had no reason to be there, and this arrived the night after his death. She laid the parcel on the table and untied the twine. Inside, wrapped in a layer of protective cloth, was yet another mask. It was identical in style to the cracked one we had received from Reverend Merrow. Porcelain, Venetian, and grotesque in expression, though this one bore no fracture. Instead, it had a black tear painted beneath one eye. Holmes leaned in. "The tear is not part of the original design," he murmured. "It was added later, likely with a sable brush, still wet when wrapped. See here, Watson, the smudge against the linen." He turned to Miss Hirschfeld. "Did your fiancé ever perform in Il Matto Nero?" "No," she said, "but he mentioned it once. Said he'd been offered a part in a revival staged by a private company. Something exclusive, invitation only. He was excited at first, but then he changed. He stopped speaking about it, started sleeping with the lights on, said he was being watched, then he drowned." Holmes's face was unreadable. "This private company, did he name it?" "Number only. Once did he refer to them at all. He called them the ones who wear the truth on their faces. I thought it was a metaphor. Lionel always spoke in riddles when anxious. But now," she gestured to the mask, "now I wonder if it was literal." "Miss Hirschfeld," Holmes said, "I believe your fiancé may have crossed paths with the same circle that once ensnared Gideon Merrow. If so, then your instincts in coming here were both correct and timely. I ask only this. Has anyone approached you? Threatened you?" "No," she said. "But 3 nights ago, someone left a card on my doorstep. Blank, except for a single letter in gold." Holmes arched an eyebrow. "Which letter?" "V," she whispered. He turned away and pressed his fingers together in front of his mouth. The firelight played across his features, casting deep shadows into his eyes. "The Brotherhood of Truth, La Fratellanza di Verité," he murmured. "If the V is what I believe, then they've stepped out of the wings and onto the stage once more." I felt a chill pass over me. "You believe they've returned to London?" "I believe they never truly left." He turned back to Anna Hirschfeld. "Miss Hirschfeld, you must not return home tonight. I will arrange a secure place for you to stay. My brother has resources we may call upon. In the meantime, Watson and I shall pay a visit to the riverbank where your fiancé was found. There may yet be a piece of the story drowned with him." She nodded, visibly relieved. Holmes took the second mask and laid it beside the cracked one. Their identical shape, marred by different forms of tragedy, one split, the other weeping, formed a tableau as haunting as any portrait. As we made ready to leave, I could not help but feel we were no longer simply solving a puzzle. We were being led through a performance, each scene carefully staged, each prop selected for effect. And somewhere in the wings, the director of this dark drama waited for our entrance into the final act. The night had drawn itself into a murky cloak by the time Holmes and I reached the Thames embankment near Southwark Bridge. A thick, oily mist clung to the river's surface, curling upward like a living thing. The gas lamps along the riverside gave off a feeble glow, distorted by fog and the smear of coal soot in the air. Even in the clamour of London's unquiet night, there was something subdued about this stretch of the riverbank, something hushed, as though the place itself were holding its breath. Holmes led us along the slick cobbles, his lantern casting long shadows between the iron balustrades. We stopped at a narrow set of steps descending to the water, where algae clung to the lower rungs like pale green fingers. "This is where Bragg's body was recovered," he murmured. "Pulled from the water by a wharfman delivering crates to the East Quay. According to the coroner's report, the cause of death was asphyxiation consistent with drowning, no visible trauma, no alcohol in the blood. Dressed, curiously, in formal evening wear. No wallet, no watch." "Robbery?" I offered. Holmes shook his head. The pockets were unturned, no signs of struggle. Whatever was taken, if anything, was removed cleanly, no bruising on the wrists or neck. If he struggled, it left no mark. He crouched beside a mooring post, examining the rings of rust and scum where the river met the steps. "Too much time has passed for the water to tell us anything now," he said, rising again. "But this was not a random death. He was brought here. By force? Not necessarily. I suspect he was lured. I've seen it before. When a man is drawn by something personal, by guilt or terror, the dead come to the river not always to flee, but to meet something they believe they cannot escape." He turned and looked up toward the bridge itself. "There, that arch." The wharfman's report said the body drifted from beneath it. "Come, Watson." We ascended a sloping path to the bridge's undercroft. The space beneath was cavernous and damp, echoing faintly with the rhythmic slap of river water. Beneath the central span, Holmes knelt once again and ran his hand along the stone ledge. "Here," he said, "candle wax. Burned recently. A small stub, black with the scent of sandalwood. Not something you find sold on a London corner." I knelt beside him. Could it be coincidence? This area must see all manner of trysts and rituals. He handed me a matchbox retrieved from a narrow crevice in the wall. "Not when it's paired with this. Traviata Costume Hire, the same establishment that provided Dorsey's garments. Someone stood here recently, lit this candle and waited, possibly watched Bragg's final moments." He straightened and walked several paces to a battered iron post set into the brickwork. There, he pointed out a series of faint markings, a triangle carved by hand, with the same eye-inset symbol we had seen inside the unfinished mask at Rico Belanti's studio. "It's their mark," Holmes said. "This site was chosen with care. It was not merely a place of death, but a stage. They wanted the river to conceal the act, but left the program behind, for those who know how to read it." He stared into the mist for a long moment, and I could almost feel his thoughts arranging themselves, the gears of deduction turning. "We have 2 masks and 2 dead men, connected by a vanished brother and a vanished artisan. But the pattern remains incomplete. The question is no longer what they are doing, it is why. And to answer that, we must understand what binds these victims." We returned to Baker Street in the early hours, the fog having thickened to a near wall of silence. I'd scarcely hung up my coat when Holmes strode directly to the desk and retrieved Gideon Merrow's notebook once more. "There was something," he muttered, flipping pages with increasing agitation. "Something about the masks. Yes. Giovanni said the mask feels wrong. He claims it's cursed. And then later, there's something in the eyes. I feel watched even when I wear it." He stopped suddenly, tapping the page. This line, the artist spoke of mirrors, of something ancient that sees through the performer, that the mask does not hide, but reveals. He looked up at me with a glint of sharpness. "Watson, I need you to retrieve the cracked mask from the mantel and bring a magnifying lens." I did as instructed, and Holmes laid the mask upon the desk, the lamplight catching its jagged split like a scar. He examined the inner surface carefully, then paused. "Ah," he said softly, "there is something here." He lifted the mask and tilted it so the inner layer, beneath the porcelain, caught the light at a certain angle. Barely visible, so faint it could be mistaken for a hairline flaw, was a sequence of characters etched into the lining. "Latin," he said, partially abbreviated. "Veritas in persona, oculus aeternus." The truth in the face, the eternal eye. "It sounds religious," I said. "Or cultic," Holmes replied grimly. "These masks were not merely for performance. They were part of a belief system, a philosophy perhaps. The actor, once masked, was no longer playing a role. He was becoming a vessel. If this brotherhood believed that truth could only be revealed through the abandonment of identity, then the mask was not a costume, it was a transformation. And if a man resisted that transformation, Holmes met my eyes, then perhaps he became dangerous or expendable. A knock came at the door just then, sharp, impatient. Before Mrs. Hudson could respond, Holmes was already there, opening it. Inspector Lestrade stood in the hall, his expression pinched with cold and consternation. "Holmes," he said without preamble, "I've come straight from Chelsea. There's been another one." "Another death?" "Another mask." He handed Holmes a sealed envelope. Inside was a photograph, grainy and taken in the pale light of early dawn. It showed a man lying prostrate on the marble floor of a public gallery. His face was obscured, but beside him, resting neatly atop a display pedestal, was a third mask. This one bore no crack, no tear. Instead, it had no mouth at all. Holmes turned the photograph slowly in his hand. "Where was this taken?" "The Overture Gallery," Lestrade said. "Private club for artists and patrons. Member only. The man's name is Francis Ellery, patron of experimental theatre. Found dead beside a modernist sculpture just before opening. No wounds, no struggle. Mask perfectly placed. It wasn't his." Holmes's voice was very quiet. "Yes, it was meant for us." He turned to me. "Watson, we are not witnessing a string of coincidences. We are witnessing the continuation of a ritual, one that began in Naples and has now taken root in London. This brotherhood, they are not done. Not yet. 3 masks, 3 deaths. But what does one do after the third act, Watson?" I swallowed. "The curtain falls." Holmes shook his head. "Number after the curtain comes the encore, and I fear we are the audience they're playing to now." Holmes stood for several moments staring at the photograph Lestrade had brought, his fingers tracing the smooth edge as though it might yield some final confession. Then, without a word, he strode across to the table and laid it down next to the other 2 masks, the cracked, the weeping, and now the mute. A grim tableau, 3 faces of silence, forming their own macabre triptych beneath the flickering lamplight. 3 masks, 3 victims, Holmes murmured, each bearing a distinct modification, fracture, tear, absence. A thematic progression, perhaps. I moved closer. A progression of what? "Stages of repression," he said absently. "Or perhaps transformation, the cracked mask, splintered identity, the weeping mask, grief or confession. This final one, no mouth, no voice, silence, either an end or a preparation." Lestrade, shifting uneasily, cleared his throat. "We found no signs of struggle at the gallery, no poison, no trauma, no witnesses. The security guard swears he'd only stepped out for 3 minutes. Ellery was alone the whole time, and the mask, well, same construction as the others. Porcelain, Italian design. Anything unusual in Ellery's background? Not really. A patron of fringe theatre, financial backer of an independent troupe. The Mirror's Edge, they call themselves. Their headquarters are in Limehouse. Very avant-garde by all accounts, but respectable." Holmes' eyes lit with sudden energy. "The Mirror's Edge. You know them?" "Only by mention," Holmes said, already reaching for his coat. "They held an exhibition 2 years ago. Persona, the face behind the flesh. I remember it well. It was said to be inspired by a lost Neapolitan play. I believe they've been toying with this brotherhood's mythology for some time. Perhaps not knowingly, but certainly dangerously." He turned to Lestrade. "You will find no conventional killer here, Inspector. These men did not die by blade or blunt force. They were destroyed by influence, drawn into something that robbed them of the will to resist. This brotherhood is not a cult of the knife. It is a theatre of the mind. But the body inevitably follows." Lestrade frowned. "You think they're killing people with ideas? With the suggestion of truth and the stripping away of illusion. If a man believes he has no self, no boundary, he becomes malleable, obedient, and if he resists that belief, he is punished." Lestrade scoffed, but not with conviction. He had seen enough of Holmes's deductions to hesitate before doubting too strongly. "And what now?" Another body? Holmes shook his head. Number an intervention. The pattern is nearing completion, but it hasn't reached its conclusion yet. He turned to me. Watson, we go to Limehouse. The headquarters of the Mirror's Edge was nestled in a foggy side alley between the crumbling walls of old dock buildings. From the outside, it appeared to be little more than an abandoned warehouse, its windows boarded and its signage faint beneath layers of grime. But a faint flicker of candlelight behind the cracks in the shutters betrayed activity within. Holmes approached the door and rapped sharply 3 times. A slot opened at eye level, and a pale pair of eyes blinked out at us. We're not holding auditions, came a woman's voice, dry and irritated. We're not actors, Holmes said smoothly. We are investigating the death of Francis Ellery, and we are aware of your company's association with the late Lionel Bragg and Gideon Merrow. The eyes blinked again, then the slot slammed shut. A moment later, bolts scraped back and the door creaked open. The woman who admitted us was striking, though not beautiful in a conventional sense. She wore black from neck to heel and had the bearing of someone who had spent too many years commanding silent rooms. Her voice was low, clipped. I am Calla Venn, artistic director. I won't say you're welcome, but I'll say I'm curious. Come in. The interior was sparse and theatrical. Painted black walls, hanging drapes, odd sculptures crafted from what appeared to be scrap metal and mirror fragments. A small stage stood at the far end, encircled by heavy curtains. The space smelled of old incense, dust, and something faintly acidic. We knew Bragg, Venn said, guiding us to a table set with mismatched chairs. He sponsored a performance we never staged, said he wanted to revive a piece from Naples. He called it The Fool Without Shadow, very abstract, claimed it had been suppressed, cursed even. She sat opposite Holmes, folding her arms. I told him we didn't deal in ghosts. He laughed and said that was precisely why we must. Did he ever mention an organization, a society behind the work? Once. Called it a brotherhood. But the way he said it, it sounded like a joke. I didn't take it seriously. She frowned. Then, about 6 weeks before his death, he stopped showing up. When we reached out, his manservant said he was preparing. I never found out what that meant. Holmes leaned forward. Did he leave anything behind? She hesitated. A manuscript, scribbled in half English, half Italian. Rambling stuff. Fragments of dialogue. Repetitions. Symbols. May I see it? She stood and disappeared behind a velvet curtain. Holmes and I sat in silence for a moment, the sound of our breathing oddly loud in the suffocating stillness of the room. When she returned, she carried a leather-bound folio. Holmes opened it carefully. Inside were pages covered in looping handwriting, erratic spacing, and symbols I recognized from earlier, eyes within triangles, cracked masks, waltz notations. It's nonsense, Venn said. Unstageable. Holmes did not reply. He was too engrossed. He stopped at one page, the ink blotched with what might have been water or tears. 3 must fall for the curtain to rise. 1 must remain unseen. The mirror breaks when the audience sees itself. Another page bore a set of names. Merrow, Bragg, Ellery. And then a blank line. Holmes closed the folio. Someone is writing this play in blood, he said softly. And the final role has yet to be filled. He turned to Venn. Have any of your company disappeared recently? She blinked. Now that you mention it. Yes. A set designer. Quiet fellow. Name was Luca Wren. Missed rehearsal last week, then stopped answering his post. But actors vanish all the time, Mr. Holmes. Not like this, Holmes said. Tell me, Miss Venn, did he ever wear a mask during rehearsal? She looked at him strangely. He made them. Holmes stood. Watson, we must return to Baker Street. Immediately. I believe the final act is already beginning, and we may be the ones holding the curtain cord. As we left the theater behind and stepped into the thick fog of Limehouse, Holmes paused, glanced back once, and murmured to himself, "Not to me. They're not killing to conceal the truth. They're killing to reveal it." The fog thickened as we made our way back toward Baker Street, clinging to our coats and seeping into the folds of the evening like a malign presence. Holmes walked in absolute silence, his brow deeply furrowed, one hand tugging absently at his glove as if lost in the rhythms of some internal metronome. I had seen this before, the slow inward rotation of his mind as disparate pieces began to turn toward their place in the mechanism. Yet something in his manner unsettled me more than usual. He was not merely piecing together evidence. He was anticipating. Once we reached our lodgings, he moved swiftly to the desk, where he cleared the surface with a single sweep and laid out the folio Calaven had given him. Beside it, he placed the 3 masks and the torn corner of costume fabric we had found at Rico Belanti's abandoned shop. The photograph of Ellery's body, too, joined the grim display. Holmes stood over them all as if surveying a battlefield. "There's a rhythm here," he said, almost to himself. "It's not a sequence of crimes. It's a rehearsal, a performance revisited. They are restaging something." I stepped beside him. Restaging what exactly?" He tapped the folio. "This manuscript. It is not merely notes. It's a ritual disguised as a script. A 4th name was meant to complete the quartet. But instead of filling that blank, our killer, or orchestrator, has erased the boundary between the performance and reality." "And Luca Wren?" I asked. "You believe he's the final victim?" "No," Holmes replied. "I believe he's the final player." I stared at him. "You mean he's alive?" Holmes nodded. "If I'm correct, he is being prepared to assume the final role. The one that brings the whole story to its climax. And if that role is what I suspect it to be, then his life may be preserved only as long as the audience remains in suspense." He turned abruptly to the cabinet by the fireplace and retrieved a set of maps, spreading one across the table. With a charcoal pencil, he marked the locations of the 3 deaths: Bragg at Southwark, Ellery at the Overture Gallery in Chelsea, and the Vicarage Garden in Hampstead, where the mask first appeared. A long silence followed as Holmes studied the triangulation. Then, slowly, he drew a connecting line between the 3 sites. It formed a scalene triangle, irregular, but deliberate. "Now look here," he said, drawing a line from the triangle's center, extending eastward. It pointed unmistakably to Limehouse. "They're drawing the final act inward," he said. "Everything collapses toward the center, and that center is the mirror's edge. The company is not incidental. They are the vessel." Before I could reply, the front door rattled below and Mrs. Hudson called up, "Telegram for Mr. Holmes." Holmes snatched it from her hand moments later, tearing it open as he returned to the room. His eyes scanned the message once, then a second time, more slowly. "It's from Mycroft," he said. "He's traced Belanti's bank records. For months following his disappearance, small sums were withdrawn from his account and transferred to a private post office box in Limehouse, the same address Luca Wren gave when applying for his work permit." My breath caught. "You mean Wren may not be Wren at all?" "I mean he may be someone Belanti trusted, or someone who took Belanti's place." Holmes turned on his heel. "Watson, there is no time. The final act will not wait for our applause. We must return to Limehouse, and not as spectators. Tonight, we enter their theater." It was close to midnight when we reached the alley again. This time, Holmes did not knock. He bypassed the main door and led me around the rear of the building, where a narrow wooden stair ascended to what appeared to be a loft entrance. A faint light glowed behind a crack in the door. Holmes withdrew a slender tool from his coat and, with quiet efficiency, manipulated the lock until it yielded with a soft click. We stepped into the upper corridor of the theater, unlit save for the flickering of a single candle down the far end. The smell of wax and aged cloth filled the air. Voices murmured below. We moved silently across the wooden floor toward a high grate that overlooked the stage. Holmes crouched and peered through. Below, on the stage, a figure stood beneath a harsh, narrow beam of light. He wore no mask, but in his hand he held one, the mute mask. Beside him stood another man in a long, dark coat, partially obscured by shadow. Holmes froze. "Wren," he whispered, "and Dorsey." The man in the coat was speaking, his voice low and sonorous. "You will say nothing. You will feel nothing. Only the audience remains. Only they see. You are the face. Nothing more." Wren stared at the mask in his hand. He was pale, visibly shaking. "I don't understand what you want." Dorsey stepped forward and placed a hand on his shoulder. "It is not for you to understand, only to perform. The mirror breaks when the audience sees itself." Holmes stood slowly. "We must move now, Watson, before the scene is completed." We crept down a back stair and entered the wings just as Dorsey turned to retrieve something from a table, an object wrapped in black velvet. Holmes moved like lightning. He crossed the distance and seized Dorsey's wrist before he could react, wrenching the cloth away. Beneath it was a small vial of amber liquid and a folded letter. "Enough of the theater," Holmes snapped. "The play ends here." Wren stumbled backward in surprise. Dorsey's eyes narrowed. "You're too late," he said calmly. "The audience has already arrived." Holmes turned sharply, and it was then I saw them. In the gallery above the stage, perhaps a dozen figures stood in total silence, masked and unmoving, as though they had been there the entire time. Their masks were all identical, plain, white, and unbroken. Wren stared upward, his voice breaking. "Who are they?" Holmes took the mask from his hand gently. "They are believers, or actors, or both." Dorsey smiled thinly. "They came to see the truth." Holmes glanced at me. "Watson, burn it." I seized the folio from the side table where Dorsey had placed it and tossed it into the brazier. The manuscript caught quickly, flames licking the edges of the parchment, consuming the ink and symbols in madness. Dorsey lunged forward, but Holmes struck him hard across the temple with his cane. He crumpled to the stage floor. The masked figures in the gallery began to murmur. Just a whisper, a susurrus of discontent, but none moved. Holmes turned to them. "The script is gone. The performance is over. There is no fourth act. There never was." One by one, the masks turned away. Within moments, the gallery was empty. Holmes knelt beside Wren. "You're safe now. The role is broken. You do not have to be the face for them." The young man looked at him with trembling disbelief. "But what if it was already inside me?" Holmes's eyes were dark and unreadable. "Then, my dear fellow, the mask is not what protects us from the truth. It may be what protects us from ourselves." We left the theater in silence, leaving Lestrade to gather the fragments. The fog had not lifted, but the weight in the air had changed, as though the night had exhaled. Only later, in the warmth of Baker Street, did Holmes speak again. "3 deaths, 1 spared, a curtain drawn back. But some stages," he said, "never quite close. They remain, ready for the next audience, the next performance." He looked toward the window, where the faintest reflection of his own face shimmered in the glass. "And the mirror," he added quietly, "always waits to be broken." The following morning dawned grey and slow, as if London itself were reluctant to rise after the spectral performance of the night before. Holmes had not slept. I found him seated by the fire, pipe clenched between his teeth, the embers casting deep shadows across his face. His gaze had not moved from the masks laid out on the table, the cracked, the weeping, the mute, each now rendered inert, yet still whispering of what might have been. He did not speak as I entered, nor did he glance up. It was I who broke the silence. Lestrade wired just before 8. Dorsey has been detained. Luca Wren is under observation at St. Bartholomew's. He's lucid, though shaken. They say he may recover fully." Holmes nodded once, almost absently. "And the others?" I pressed. "The masked observers? The so-called audience?" "Gone," he said at last, "like phantoms after the curtain falls. The police searched the premises, but not a soul remained. The costumes, the props, all real. But the people, no names, no records." He leaned back slightly. "What's troubling is that I'm no longer certain they were actors, or if the play we witnessed was simply a performance in form only." I sat down across from him, trying to suppress the weariness in my limbs. "Holmes, you said something last night, that they weren't killing to conceal the truth, but to reveal it. Do you truly believe that?" He removed the pipe and stared into the dying fire. "I do. Each death was symbolic. The fractured mask, a man torn between what he was and what they wished him to become. The weeping mask, grief, perhaps remorse, for what had been seen or lost. And finally, the mute mask, a man silenced, made an object, an offering to the theater itself. They weren't random, they were ritual." "Then what of Luca Wren? Why was he spared?" "Because he was the final mirror," Holmes said softly. "The others were reflections of those who had seen too much and broken beneath the weight of it. But Wren was young, uncertain, moldable. They wanted him to become the next face, the vessel for their continuation." He stood abruptly and turned to the desk, retrieving a letter from beneath a stack of correspondence. "This came early this morning," he said, handing it to me. "From Anna Hirschfeld." I opened it and read aloud. "Mr. Holmes, I am leaving London today. I cannot remain in the city that swallowed Lionel. But I must thank you, not only for what you uncovered, but for confirming that I was not mad, that something did indeed take him from me. I leave behind the mask he received. I ask that you destroy it. Whatever it once meant, it holds only sorrow now. Yours in solemn gratitude." A.H. beneath the letter was a small box. Holmes opened it with delicate care. Inside lay the weeping mask. "I told her it should be incinerated," he said. "Yet I confess I was not eager to see it lost. A dangerous sentiment, perhaps, but one that has its uses." He held the mask up, turning it in the morning light. "I am convinced these masks were never merely props. Belanti, the artisan, must have believed he was creating vessels, faces through which this brotherhood of verite might manifest their philosophy, or their madness. Perhaps both." "What becomes of the brotherhood now?" I asked. "If Dorsey was the architect of this performance, and Wren has been removed from their influence, is it over?" Holmes paused. "The director is gone, the play aborted, but the theater remains. Those masked watchers did not intervene. They only observed. That is the danger of such systems, Watson. When belief is shared by many, but responsibility by none, it becomes something far more difficult to dismantle." He crossed to the window and stood in silence, watching as the fog began to lift from Baker Street. "I believe this brotherhood has existed in shifting forms for decades, perhaps centuries. Disbanded, disguised, revived again in art, in politics, in cultish corners of Europe's underground. This was merely London's turn to host the production." A knock sounded at the door, and Mrs. Hudson entered with a silver tray. "Telegram for you, Mr. Holmes. From Naples." Holmes took it, unfolded the slip, and read silently. Then he handed it to me without a word. "Gideon Merrow found Institute San Michele, survived fire. 1890, severe psychosis, no memory of theater, calls himself the Unmasked. Inspector Lorenzo. Naples Polizia." "Good heavens," I breathed. "He's alive." "Barely," Holmes said, "but enough to confirm it. What does it mean, that he escaped the original ritual?" Holmes shook his head. "I think he was the original experiment, the prototype for what the Brotherhood sought to perfect. They broke him in Naples and have been trying to refine the method ever since. He turned again to the weeping mask, now resting on its black velvet cushion. Perhaps that is why they left the mask with Anna. Not as a threat, but as an inheritance. The clock on the mantel chimed the hour, and I felt a strange sense of closure settling over the room. And yet Holmes's gaze remained troubled. "There is one detail," he said slowly, "that continues to plague me." "What is that?" He walked to the folio, now reduced to ash in the small grate. Dorsey's final line, "The mirror breaks when the audience sees itself." What if that wasn't a metaphor? I frowned. "What do you mean?" He turned, his eyes sharper now. "What if the Brotherhood's objective was not to enact a performance, but to reveal something about the audience? About us?" The question hung in the air like lingering smoke. We sat in silence for a long while. Outside, London stirred as if nothing had happened. The carriages clattered down the streets. The vendors cried out, and life resumed its daily rhythm. But something had changed in the depths of the city. Something invisible, perhaps, but no less real. The masks would remain with us for a time until Holmes decided their fate. Whether as evidence, as trophies, or as warnings, I could not yet say. But I knew this much. The curtain had fallen, the lights extinguished, and the players had taken their leave. And yet, somewhere in the wings, the next audience was already gathering. The hours passed without incident, yet a peculiar tension remained suspended in the flat at 221B. Holmes, though quiet, was far from idle. He spent the remainder of the day cross-referencing theatre programs, handwritten notes from Merrow's recovered diary, and architectural plans of the Limehouse warehouse, all laid out with his usual fastidious care. I observed him from the corner armchair, nursing a second cup of tea and trying, without much success, to suppress the lingering unease from the night's ordeal. But it wasn't the masks or the cult-like fraternity that haunted me. It was the audience. Those silent, still figures watching from the gallery, shrouded not in costume but in intent. They had not flinched, had not spoken, had not intervened. And yet I could not shake the feeling that we had not stopped them. We had only confused them. The script had been interrupted, not rewritten. Holmes suddenly broke the silence. "I've been considering the letter Merrow received," he said, eyes still fixed on a spread of notes. Or rather, the absence of a letter. The mask delivered to the vicarage bore no message, no signature, only silence and blood. That, Watson, was our first clue. Not just to the Brotherhood's methods, but to their philosophy. "Meaning?" I asked, leaning forward. "Meaning they reject interpretation," Holmes replied. "Or more precisely, they compel the observer to construct meaning. No narrative is handed down. The performer wears the mask. The audience sees only what it chooses. Each death, each symbolic prop becomes a mirror." I frowned. "You believe the deaths were meant to be interpreted differently by different people?" "Exactly. Bragg, Ellery, even the attempted transformation of Wren, these weren't executions. They were provocations. The Brotherhood doesn't reveal truth. It engineers the conditions for others to expose their own." He tapped a note. "And here is the detail I missed. At each site, Southwark Bridge, the Overture Gallery, the stage at Mirror's Edge, there was one common object never catalogued properly by the Yard." I rose and joined him at the table. He pointed to a small ink notation beside the gallery floor plan. "A mirror," he said, "in each location." I blinked. "You're certain?" Without question, the mirror at Southwark was fixed above a mooring post, cracked and stained. At the gallery, it was an installation piece. Ellery was found beside it. At the theatre, the entire backdrop of the stage was composed of shattered reflective panels. Then it was the audience. Being invited to see themselves, yes. And perhaps to ask, what part of this do you recognize? What are you pretending not to know? That is the danger of the Brotherhood. They do not impose belief. They weaponize self-discovery. A knock at the door interrupted us. It was Lestrade, unusually brisk and lacking his typical formality. "I need a word," he said, stepping inside. "You'll want to hear this." He tossed a folded note on the table. Holmes opened it silently, then handed it to me. The paper was stiff, expensive, the handwriting looped and deliberate. "Dear Mr. Holmes, you have disturbed the performance, but not the message. There will be no fourth death, not by our hand. The curtain has fallen, the stage is empty, but the audience remains. You cannot arrest a reflection." V. Holmes gave a slow, grim smile. "They're retreating." "Or dispersing," Lestrade offered. "We're sweeping the warehouse again, found evidence of a separate entrance, likely how those masked figures arrived and left unseen. But we've got nothing concrete on any of them, no prints, no names, just shadows." "And Luca Wren?" Holmes asked. Lestrade hesitated. "That's why I'm here. He's vanished. Walked out of the hospital this morning. No signs of forced exit. He left behind his chart, his clothes, but not his mask." Holmes went still. "He took it with him." "So it would seem. Or someone took him." A long silence followed. Then Holmes moved to the fireplace and began to pace, his movements sharp with urgency. "They've altered the script. No final death, but an unresolved role. Wren may not be a victim now. He may be something else." "A convert," I said. "Or a rogue element. They planned for a fourth act, and we denied them. But a play denied its ending doesn't vanish. It festers. I fear Wren may now see himself as the unfinished performance. And unfinished stories," he said darkly, "often find a new stage." Lestrade shook his head. "There's no evidence he's dangerous." "There's no evidence he's himself," Holmes replied. "Not after what he's seen, what he nearly became. The mind is a fragile theatre, Lestrade. You can close the curtain, but the actors may still wander the set." He turned to me, then to Lestrade. "We must put the word out quietly. No headlines, no police bulletins, but every theatre, gallery, rehearsal space. Keep them watched. If Wren attempts to perform anything, I want to know." Lestrade nodded grimly and left. The door closed behind him with a soft thud. Holmes remained standing by the fire. I poured him a cup of tea, which he accepted without thanks. "There's more to come," he said finally. "This brotherhood is not merely a group. It is an idea, one that hides behind art and ritual, but seeks the same end: the dissolution of identity, the collapse of narrative. In an age growing tired of certainty, such ideas are perilously seductive." He sipped once, then set the cup down. "I thought at first we were dealing with murder cloaked in mysticism, but I see now it was the inverse, mysticism weaponized through murder. The masks were not disguises. They were invitations." "And what of the cracked one?" I asked. "The first. The beginning." Holmes turned to it. He lifted it gently, then, with sudden finality, shattered it against the hearthstone. The pieces fell with a hollow ring. "No more invitations," he said. "The theatre is closed." But the look in his eyes told me he did not believe it. And deep down, neither did I. Holmes sat unmoving after the mask shattered, watching the fragments as if they still possessed agency, as if the shape they had once held continued to echo in the spaces between them. The only sound in the room was the soft ticking of the mantel clock, its rhythm far too certain to match the creeping uncertainty that now hung in the air. I had long become accustomed to Holmes's manner in the aftermath of cases. He often withdrew once resolution had been reached, leaving the loose ends to the hands of Scotland Yard or the obscuring comfort of forgetfulness. But this was different. The end had not ended. The mystery had not revealed a culprit so much as a method, one still alive, still evolving. "It was not a letter of surrender," Holmes said at last, rising and brushing the porcelain dust from his fingers. The message from V was a transition, an announcement that the theatre is no longer theirs alone. They've released it. I stood, unsettled. Released it to whom? To anyone with a mirror, he replied. To anyone who dares to look at their own face and wonder what lies beneath. That, Watson, is what they've crafted. Not a play, not a cult, but a contagion of thought. Invisible, abstract, and thus profoundly difficult to trace. He walked to the window and parted the curtains. Outside, the fog was lifting. The streets of Marylebone resumed their mundane patterns. But Holmes's eyes weren't on the pavement below. They were on the reflections in the glass. They've moved from performance to propagation, he murmured. No longer recruiting, they are seeding. A knock came at the door. This time quick, staccato, hesitant. Mrs. Hudson's voice followed it. "Telegram, sir. Very urgent." I opened the door and accepted the slip, noting the mark of dispatch from the Metropolitan. Holmes read it over my shoulder. "Mirror found smashed in Exeter Hall green room. No signs of entry. Stage curtain drawn. Script on floor. Blank. Constable Hughes, Theatrical Division." "Exeter Hall," I said. "Isn't that—" "A temperance hall and meeting space," Holmes cut in, already reaching for his coat. "Not a theatre by trade, but they host lectures, concerts, public forums, a perfect setting for a trial run." "A performance? Or the ghost of one? Come, Watson." By the time we arrived at Exeter Hall, the police had cordoned off the green room, though the building remained open to the public above. Constable Hughes met us at the rear entrance and ushered us inside with hushed urgency. "No body," he said at once. "No damage except the mirror and this." He handed Holmes a folded square of thick paper, creased twice with a single black smudge at the corner. Holmes opened it. Inside was a sheet of fine parchment, completely empty save for one symbol drawn in the lower right corner, the eye within the triangle. "No message," Hughes said. "Not even a watermark. Just this." Placed on the floor beneath the smashed mirror. Curtain was drawn across the stage, though no one saw who did it. Holmes moved past him and stepped into the green room. The mirror had been utterly destroyed. Its shards glimmered beneath the footlights like frozen tears. The room was cold and carried that peculiar stillness that follows intrusion, a kind of violated quiet. Holmes knelt, inspecting the largest remaining segment of glass. "There's a fingerprint," he said, "but smudged, intentionally distorted." He stood and turned to the wall, tracing his hand along the cracked plaster just beneath the window. No forced entry. No print dust. Whoever entered knew the layout, possibly someone already affiliated with the venue. "Someone planting a symbol?" I asked. "Or someone conducting a ritual," Holmes replied. "The blank script is the key. In previous scenes, the Brotherhood's manuscript contained riddles, verses, enigmatic suggestions. But now, emptiness. An invitation not to observe, but to create." He turned sharply to Constable Hughes. "Find out who was booked to perform or speak here in the last 72 hours. Cross-reference names with theatre troupes, occult societies, experimental art circles, anyone who might flirt with ideas like persona dissolution or identity reformation." Hughes scribbled notes and departed with a nod. Holmes remained, unmoving again, staring at the stage's closed curtain. "Do you see, Watson?" he said softly. "The stage is closed, but the play continues. The Brotherhood has become an absence, a gap in the script. They are not staging a truth. They are inviting others to fabricate one, to fill the silence with their own chaos." "And Luca Wren?" I asked. "Do you believe he's behind this?" Holmes was quiet for a moment. Then, number. "I believe he's a vector, a carrier of what he saw. The mirror, the masks, they changed him, but not into one of them, into someone worse, someone between." He turned from the shattered mirror and walked toward the door. "He's not performing the Brotherhood script anymore. He's writing his own." Back at Baker Street, Holmes began assembling a list. Names and addresses pulled from the Mirror's Edge membership rolls, survivors of Belanti's early performances in Naples, theatre critics who had publicly admired Il Mattonero. To my dismay, he also added a few prominent psychiatrists, philosophers, even politicians. These people, he explained, all flirt with the idea that identity is performative, that the self is a fiction, normally harmless, but under the wrong influence, such ideas become catalytic. If the Brotherhood has shifted to a mimetic model, spreading via thought rather than initiation, then these individuals are prime points of infection. Holmes, you're describing a movement, not a case. I'm describing both, he said flatly, and we must treat it like a contagion, track its patterns, intervene early, isolate the narrative, suppress the symbols. And what of 5? I asked. Holmes paused. I believe V is no longer a person, he said at last. It is a role, a title passed forward, like the mask itself. Whoever signs with it now isn't leading. They're watching, directing perhaps, but no longer writing. That has been left to others. He returned to the window, folding his arms. They've achieved what few secret societies ever do. They've erased themselves and left behind only reflection. We stood in silence, the city humming faintly outside. And for the first time in all our years together, I realized this was not a case we could close. We had disrupted the performance, saved a life, revealed a pattern, but we had not solved it, because the mystery no longer wore a face. It wore 1,000. 2 nights later, I returned to Baker Street with a reluctant heart. I had spent the afternoon at St. Bartholomew's, where I had hoped, futilely, to find Luca Wren returned or at least traced. Instead, I had spoken with the matron and 2 orderlies, each offering the same bewildered refrain. He was quiet, odd, but not violent. And then he was gone. The silence Holmes had predicted was spreading. There were murmurs in fringe artistic circles about mirrors that revealed too much, and amateur actors reciting fragments of dialogue they insisted came to them in dreams. Yet there was no crime, no suspects, no blood, only suggestions, flickers. In the language of medicine, it was a patient presenting with symptoms, but no identifiable cause. Holmes sat by the window, as he had for 3 days running, silhouetted against the lamplight like a shadow watching its reflection. I'd come prepared to report failure, but before I could speak, he lifted one hand, sharp and sudden, and gestured to the table. Laid out neatly was a folded newspaper, the Evening Standard, its front page bearing the headline, Mystery Performance. Stuns audience at E. Lyceum. Stage found. Empty script reads only look up. Beneath it was a short column. Patrons at last night's one-night-only invitation. Only showcase at the Lyceum Theatre were left in stunned silence after the curtain rose to reveal an empty stage, save for a single mirror suspended in mid-air. As the audience took their seats, ushers reportedly handed out programs containing no cast list, no title, and only a single line. Look up. At the end of the hour, the curtain fell again, without sound or actor. Witnesses described the experience as unsettling, transformative, and difficult to explain. Holmes tapped the column once. Luca Wren was there, not physically but architecturally. This was his debut, not as actor, as director. I stared. You believe he staged the event? After all that's happened? I believe, Holmes said, he took what the Brotherhood left unfinished and made it palatable, stripped it of its overt menace and reintroduced it as performance art. An idea that invites, not terrifies, that cloaks itself in intellectualism and therefore spreads faster. And the audience? I asked. They were part of it? They are it now, Holmes replied. A mirror doesn't create the image. It reflects what stands before it. The Brotherhood once needed secrecy and symbols. Wren has made them obsolete. He doesn't need to kill. He only needs to show. He stood and walked to the hearth, where the last remains of the cracked mask still lay, untouched since he'd shattered it. "I've spent my life pursuing clarity," he said quietly. "Identifying what is hidden, revealing what is false. But now we face a danger that cannot be arrested or exiled. A danger that, like a virus, replicates within interpretation itself." "And yet," I said carefully, "no law has been broken. No one was harmed at the Lyceum." Holmes turned to me with the calm of a man who has read too far ahead in the script. "Not yet." We sat in silence a moment longer before he crossed to his desk and opened a narrow drawer. From within, he withdrew a simple envelope, sealed in wax and bearing no address. He handed it to me. "It arrived this morning. I have not opened it." I broke the seal with care. Inside was a single card, one line, scrawled in ink I recognized from the earlier letter, signed 5. "The play ends when the audience stops watching." I looked up. "It's taunt." "No," Holmes said. "It's truth." And then, almost imperceptibly, he smiled, not with triumph, but with grim purpose. "We cannot arrest an idea, Watson, but we can expose it, understand it, counter it." He gestured toward the card. "Let them invite. We shall answer with our own mirror, clear, unbroken, and facing them." "You mean to fight it?" I asked. Holmes nodded. "On the only battlefield it knows, perception. And should this theater continue, then so must our performance." He turned back to the window. "And I," he said softly, "am not yet ready for my curtain call." So the masks were burned, the names archived, the evidence locked away, not to be forgotten but studied, quietly, carefully. And though the city moved on, unaware of how close it had come to becoming an audience of one great, unknowable production, Holmes watched. He read the signs in theater announcements, in avant-garde manifestos, in the fragments of new scripts whispered through fog-shrouded alleyways. The Brotherhood had lost its form, but in doing so, it had found its stage. And so Holmes prepared for the encore, 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 for the encore.